because the United States was already the number one gas producer when Trump was elected. I mean, the Biden administration hadn't really dialed that back too much. What it's done is they've kneecapped wind and solar, which means that prices are going to go up on consumers.
Hey there, I'm Jesse Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of the Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. Voices like Steve Smith, the executive director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, who you heard up top. I've known Steve for years, and he's one of the most knowledgeable people out there when it comes to energy issues in the Southeast. We had a great conversation about the growth of solar and wind power across the region and the damage the Trump administration is doing to it. We also got into the growth of massive energy-sucking data centers and the impact they're going to have on prices and carbon emissions in our region. That conversation is coming up in just a bit. Later, in our Arts and Culture segment, we'll preview this weekend's Mississippi Book Festival, a great annual celebration in one of the South's most literary-minded states. Also, I should say right up top that we are dealing with peak ragweed season here in East Tennessee, so my voice is even more nasal and congested than usual, but bear with me. All right, it's time for the news roundup. This week, we're talking about abortion and the ongoing efforts to limit access to reproductive health across the South, and specifically in Texas, our largest state. Since the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in the Dobbs case in 2023, which stripped a constitutional right to abortion from women and girls across the United States, southern states have led the charge in criminalizing the termination of pregnancies for nearly any reason. Abortion is now completely banned under threat of felony prosecution in 7 southern states: Alabama, Arkansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Texas. It is banned after 6 weeks of pregnancy in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina, and after 12 weeks in North Carolina. Virginia is the only southern state that still allows broad legal access to abortion. But having achieved total bans in many states has not satisfied the religious fundamentalists who have long led the charge to restrict women's control of their bodies. Far from declaring victory, anti-abortion advocates in the most conservative states have become even more aggressive. This was a predictable result of the Dobbs decision. For years, the rhetoric from anti-abortion advocates focused on returning control of the issue back to the states, where the public could have its say. But that was obviously always untrue. It doesn't make any sense for somebody who believes that abortion is murder and should be treated as such to be okay with it happening in Virginia as long as it's banned in Tennessee. As much as President Donald Trump tried to avoid taking a firm position on abortion during his campaign, the fundamentalist religious groups that are a major part of his coalition are not going to be happy until abortion is illegal and criminally prosecuted everywhere in the country. And the reality is that abortion procedures are still very much happening in the United States. According to the Guttmacher Institute, a nonprofit that studies and advocates for reproductive rights, the total number of abortions has gone up since the Dobbs decision. In 2023, the first full year after the decision and the year that many statewide bans went into effect, abortions rose to 1.03 million, up 11% since 2020. It was the first time since 2012 that the country recorded more than 1 million abortions. That's not the kind of result that anti-abortion groups were looking for with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, particularly because some of the people receiving abortions are residents of states where it's illegal. According to Guttmacher, for the past 2 years, about 15% of people receiving abortions at a clinic had traveled from out of state. That's double the percentage before Dobbs, and added up to about 155,000 people last year. That included 28,000 people from Texas. In another shift, medication-based abortions, in which a patient takes pills to induce the termination of a pregnancy, now account for 63% of all abortions, up from 53% in 2020. Some numbers of those pills are being sent to people in states with abortion bans. Many states, including Texas, have already made it illegal to provide abortion medications in the state, but they don't have authority to actually enforce those laws on anyone outside their states. So this year, Texas added another layer of enforcement. A law that took effect last week allows any Texas resident to file a civil lawsuit in a Texas court against anyone who manufactures, distributes, mails, or otherwise provides abortion medication to anyone in the state. That means anyone from a vengeful family member to an anti-abortion activist could file a suit if they knew or suspected someone had received the medication. To somewhat discourage mercenary action, the bill allows a victorious plaintiff to keep only 10% of any civil award, with the rest to be given to charity. As Blair Wallace of the ACLU of Texas put it in a statement, the law, quote, exports Texas's extreme abortion ban far beyond state borders. It will fuel fear among manufacturers and providers nationwide, while encouraging neighbors to police one another's reproductive lives, further isolating pregnant Texans and punishing the people who care for them. It is unclear if the law is even constitutional, given the limits of state powers, but unless or until it's successfully challenged, it will no doubt create some concerns for anyone involved in providing the medications. Another Texas law that took effect in August is already having an impact inside the state. It forbids the use of public money at any level of government to assist in planning or travel to obtain an abortion out of state. The city of Austin, the state capital, had created a reproductive health care logistics fund last year to provide exactly those kinds of support. It was funded with $400,000 in this year's budget. But under the new state law, city officials said they have no choice but to dissolve it. Vanessa Fuentes, Austin's mayor pro tem, told the Daily Texan, quote, I'm disappointed, though not surprised, to see the state once again interfere in our efforts to care for Texans. Meanwhile, yet another new Texas law is intended to address one perhaps predictable result of the state's ban. It requires hospitals that offer maternity care to also be trained in providing bereavement counseling and services for parents whose children are stillborn. A study published in JAMA Pediatrics found that after Texas's abortion ban went into effect, infant deaths rose by 13%, and deaths from birth defects rose by 23%. Many of those were babies who likely would not have been carried to term before the ban. Hospitals are also required to provide refrigerated cooling bassinets that preserve a dead newborn's body for a few days to give parents time to grieve. These continued crackdowns are coming despite polling data that persistently shows majority support for legal abortion, even in most southern states. According to extensive polling in 2024 by the Public Religion Research Institute, 66% of American adults nationwide support broad legal access to abortion. That includes majorities in every southern state except Arkansas, where only 46% support it, and Kentucky and Mississippi, where 50% support it. In Texas, the poll showed 56% of people supported legal abortion, and only 11% supported banning abortion in all cases, which is essentially what Texas's laws do. But so far, those numbers have not translated into electoral consequences for the state's legislative supermajority, protected as it is by heavily gerrymandered districts. Okay, now we're to my interview with Steve Smith. He has been executive director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, or SACE, since 1993. The nonprofit organization is based right here in Knoxville, Tennessee, and works with power companies and governments throughout the Southeast to advocate for reduced carbon emissions and increased clean energy production. Smith has served on related boards and committees across the region, including Floridians for Solar Choice, the State of Tennessee Energy Policy Council, the North Carolina Legislative Commission on Global Climate Change, and the Tennessee Valley Authority's Regional Energy Resource Council. He holds a doctorate in veterinary medicine from the University of Tennessee and a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Kentucky Wesleyan College. He also practices what he preaches. His family home has an 11-kilowatt rooftop solar system with battery storage. Smith has also been politically active, running as a Democratic candidate for Congress in Knoxville in the 1990s. I have interviewed him on energy issues many times over the years and have always learned a lot from him. So I thought he'd be a good person to talk to about the state of both energy politics and resources in the Southeast, particularly as the Trump administration moves to deprioritize climate change as a concern and to disincentivize investments in renewable energy. We also talked about the explosion of new data centers and cryptomining operations, which are creating huge new demand for power production. He had a lot to say about all of it. So Seth, let's go to the tape. Steve Smith, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Jess. It's great to see you.
Yeah, likewise. So you have been involved in this work for a long time. I was wondering if you could start out by just giving us a bit of an overview of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, what it is, what it does, and, maybe what are a couple of your big wins or accomplishments over the years.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. And it's very relevant because we're approaching our 40th anniversary this year. So we'll be celebrating that in the fall. So the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy is an organization that is focused strictly in the Southeast. So our primary states are Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. But we also track the very large energy companies that are in the Southeast, some of the largest in the world. The Tennessee Valley Authority touches 7 states, Southern Company, Duke, NextEra's Florida Power and Light. These are some of the, like I say, literally the biggest energy companies in the world. Our primary focus is to reduce the environmental footprint of how we produce and consume energy as a species and in our region. And we have a long history of doing that. The organization started back in 1985. It was strictly focused on Tennessee and TVA. It was then called the Tennessee Valley Energy Coalition. And then in 99, we actually became the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, where we expanded outside of the Tennessee Valley Authority footprint and picked up Florida, South Carolina, and then began to do a lot of work in states outside of the TVA footprint. Our primary focus is actually really looking at carbon and climate change because that's an existential threat to humanity and all the other critters that we share the planet with. I'm a veterinarian by training, so people ask, well, how did the vet get into this? And I'm like, well, I just sort of expanded my patient much larger. The planet Earth has a number of systems, and if those systems are out of balance, it becomes diseased, and that's a very easy way to look at it. And we are taking the planet out of balance based on the emission profiles. And so we really focus on how do we reduce those emission profiles. And we look primarily at advancing clean energy, renewable energy, so wind, solar, other types of technologies that are low carbon. We look at energy efficiency because the greenest electron is the one you never use. And we have gotten, since the Deepwater Horizon, we've gotten much more into electric transportation. And so we're a leader in the region on advocating for electric vehicles, and we're seeing real movement there. And then we have the things that we're not so enthusiastic about. We've been very active in opposing and helping work to shut down coal-fired power plants because they're incredibly inefficient. They're uneconomical now, and they're one of the primary drivers of climate change. We are not enthusiastic about fossil gas. Some people call it natural gas, but it's a fossil fuel, and it has a very significant footprint both in the carbon emissions itself, but then also in the methane, and then offshore drilling. And we're not enthusiastic about nuclear power simply because we have not seen it work at the level that is promised in the Southeast. We've seen a lot of over budget and beyond schedule. We've seen a lot of money spent there, and we've seen a lot of distraction. We would rather see the utilities get their renewable footprint in line with the nuclear power footprint that they have, and then let's have a debate about, where we go from there. And so that's a lot of our work. And I would say that we quickly learned early in the work at SACE that the only way you can influence these very large energy companies is you've got to get upstream in their planning process. And if by the time the decisions become public and the public is aware of them, there's already huge investments and the momentum is there. And because these are monopolies and they have an enormous amount of political power, it is very difficult to stop a project once it gets locked and loaded and moving down the process. And so in the 1992 Energy Policy Act, the Tennessee Valley Authority was required for the first time to do a public integrated resource planning process. And that basically forced them to open up their planning. Other utilities, this is best practice. And so SACE does a lot of interventions across the region at state regulatory proceedings where we intervene where the utilities are in their planning process. And we deconstruct their arguments that we don't agree with, and then we bring in expertise and experts to come in and counter those and then try to build our case in front of the Public Service Commission or the Public Utility Commission in the states, which has jurisdiction over these state-sanctioned monopolies, to basically make decisions about how they plan. That's our core groove. And out of that core groove, we've expanded a lot of education, both of decision makers, but then also the general public and advocacy around that. And we're seeing now a confluence of, with transportation now becoming more electrified, the two primary drivers of climate change are the utility sector and the transportation sector. And now they're all merging on a point around electrification. And so we're right core at the middle of that. And I would say some of our biggest successes have been, to really be a part of the collective we. Lots of people, lots of things have gone on, but we've run very aggressive campaigns against coal because we believe that it is such a cradle-to-grave destructive process. We saw it with the Kingston coal ash spill. We've seen it with the damage to the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. We've seen it with the human health implications. And because it was a primary driver of climate change, it has been a big part of our campaigns over the years. And we've also been very strong advocates for actually getting the South to catch up with other regions in the country in renewable energy development. And now we're actually seeing the South become a leader in some states. And that was a real battle because there was a period where I used to joke, the utility executives thought the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow in the Southeast, nothing grows. And so we had to overcome that skepticism of renewable energy. But now there's actually, like Florida Power and Light is got one of the most aggressive solar programs in the country, if not in the world, underway right now. So there are successes like that. Got a lot of battle scars, a lot of gray hairs from these battles over the years, but I think we've seen real tangible success.
So where were we as of January 19th of this year in the Southeast in terms of adopting and embracing clean energy? How much momentum was there? How were you feeling about the overall landscape here at that point?
Yeah, we have felt a growing tailwind of support really over the last decade in the Southeast, because as utilities became more familiar with renewable energy, as they begin to figure out how to integrate it onto their systems, we've actually seen some utilities really stepping up and doing more. And it's been refreshing. I can remember the first megawatt of solar that went on in the TVA system. We applauded, but it's now we're talking 1,000 megawatt scale types of deployment, which are gigawatts. So that tailwind has been growing. What really accelerated it was under the Biden administration with the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a very well-crafted, tight initiative to say, we are going to actually transform energy production in this country and become a leader in clean energy. We are going to take up the challenge and compete with China. We're going to onshore manufacturing. We're going to onshore things like batteries for electric vehicles, solar and everything. And we are going to incentivize these so that they do two things. They make us competitive for the 21st century so we can compete with China and other countries. And they're going to help us solve the climate crisis because we're going to go towards a decarbonized grid and transportation sector. That really got juiced with the Inflation Reduction Act. And what it did for the Southeast was the Southeast became one of the primary beneficiaries of those investments. We saw massive investments coming into the Southeast in batteries for electric vehicles and for storage that's needed on the grid. We saw electric vehicle manufacturing coming into the Southeast in unprecedented levels, billions and billions of dollars flowing into the Southeast. So that was really flooding the zone, and there was tremendous momentum. And these were, even though the technologies were, a lot of the conservatives say, oh, well, you were picking winners and losers. Actually, the Inflation Reduction Act was technology neutral as long as the technology was decarbonization. And so therefore, there are incentives for geothermal, there are incentives for carbon capture and sequestration, there was incentives for nuclear power. It wasn't all wind and solar. But because wind and solar had gotten to be so cost competitive, they have become the dominant deployment that's been happening, not just because of the Inflation Reduction Act, because they're so cheap right now, less expensive. So that's where we were going into inauguration for Trump 2.0. And we felt hopeful because we were seeing these things coming in. We saw the private sector responding to the incentives, and we were seeing the marriage of good government policy with good private sector investment. And the United States looked like they were going to be a competitive entity for the 21st century.
So, what about now? So we've had 6 months now of this administration. Obviously, the Environmental Protection Agency is talking about rolling back its determination that climate change is a problem, basically, or a human-caused phenomenon. The Big Beautiful Bill rolled back or capped some of those incentives from the Inflation Reduction Act. And we have a president now who's back to talking about, climate change being a hoax. And we have some governors across the South who are embracing similar rhetoric. So where are we at right now?
So I think it's important to differentiate between the ill-informed, and I would just have to say ignorant, rhetorical stances that we're seeing coming out of segments of the Republican Party and what's actually happening on the ground. So you're absolutely correct. Trump has declared war on many of the things that were leading us to be a nation that was going to be competitive in the 21st century, because he talks a good game about wanting to compete with China. But the reality was that China has done so much now in the clean energy space that we needed these tools in the Inflation Reduction Act to get caught up and in a better position. Now, this is not only things like solar, batteries, electric vehicles, and this is global competition, because Trump has taken an isolationist stand in many ways, and then, is using these, kind of crazy tariffs to sort of force his will. There's not a coherent strategy. If there is a coherent strategy that is materializing in the first, 8 months or so of what it is it's like we're going to double down on being a petro oil state. We're going to double down on 19th century, 20th century technologies instead of 21st century technologies. And that is taking us backwards. But he made promises to people in the fossil fuel industry that he was going to deregulate, that he was going to hobble their main competitors, which is wind and solar, and that he was going to talk about, all this beautiful wealth that's under the ground. The problem with that is it's anti-progressive, it's anti-scientific, and is anti-global competitive, because as you extract those things from the ground, you release them into the atmosphere, and you can act like you don't understand the science, you can act like it, but it's like gravity. If you drop a rock, it's going to go down. If you put greenhouse forcing gases into the atmosphere, you are going to warm the planet, which is going to disrupt the climatic patterns. And the absolute most simple fact of this is looking at the Keeling curve, which basically measures the amount of CO2 that is in the atmosphere. And you can go back and see a relentless march going back to where it was first done by Roger Keeling in the 1950s and see how it's gone up. I was born in 1962, and the CO2 in the atmosphere was 318 parts per million. Today, it's 427, and it is on a relentless march up. You can pretend like it's not happening, but it is a physical fact of reality. And so Trump is ignoring that, and by ignoring that and enriching his fossil fuel buddies, they have rolled back much of, particularly in, I won't call it what you call it, I'll call it, the big bad bill, or I guess we didn't clear whether I could.
You can swear, it's okay.
Okay, the big bullshit bill, whatever it is. This was a horrible policy move in the sense that it basically kneecapped the the two technologies that were driving down electric energy costs, which were solar and wind. And then it has also, I think, very significantly damaged the American automobile industry's ability to be a global competitor, because it has de-incentivized their ability to move from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. And it has damaged a lot of the investment. And we are seeing that in very profound ways in the Southeast, because projects are now being canceled or being put on hold. There's a tremendous amount of confusion. The bill just passed July 4th, but the whole industry now is starting to freeze up. And Trump did some other very devious things, because there was a very radical version of the bill that came out of the House because of the Freedom Caucus and other things like that. The Senate tried to put some rationality onto the bill by saying, okay, look, if you're going to unwind some of these incentives, at least allow a glide slope so that projects that are already been capitalized and already been going and starting to move, allow them time to phase down instead of having a sharp cut. Well, the EV tax credits end the third quarter of this year, the end of September. That you're not going to be able to get the $7,500 tax credit. You're not going to be able to get the $4,000 tax credit if you basically buy a used EV. That is going to set the market back very significantly in that sector. And then many of the solar projects and everything and the wind projects have truncated versions to where they've got to be safe harbored very quickly. This looked like it was going to be devastating coming out of the House. The Senate negotiated it a little longer glide slope, but then Trump, in order to cut the deal with the Freedom Caucus, actually basically has used executive orders to even undermine what's going on in the Senate. So you see some of the senators pushing back. So there wasn't honest dealing in how they set this thing up. So it has led to a very significant short-circuiting of what would have been a planning horizon out into the 2030s that would have set the United States up to be a global competitor. It would have made a very significant dent in the U.S.'s carbon footprint. It would have accelerated the retirement of some of the older, less efficient, dirtier, high carbon emitting plants. And this would have allowed us to make that transition into the 21st century. Now we're kind of in a holding pattern to some degree. Things are frozen up to some degree as we're waiting for some of the rules of this bill to be finalized in the Treasury relative to tax policy and other things like that. So it's a setback, absolutely a setback. And then when you couple with that the fact that there's this massive deregulation agenda where EPA, the one job EPA has, sole purpose, protect the environment. Under this administration, they are actually undermining that core mission, and they're letting the lobbyists from the oil and gas industry get in there and just have at it all the ways to deregulate to allow fossil expansion in this country, while at the same time, you're seeing them actually trying to interfere in every way possible with clean energy development, wind and solar. And all that's going to do, because the United States was already the number one gas producer when Trump was elected. I mean, the Biden administration hadn't really dialed that back too much. What it's done is they've kneecapped wind and solar, which means that prices are going to go up on consumers. And this is what is going to take a little time to get into people's consciousness, but we are going to see significant increases not only in the electric sector, but in gas, because if you take more EVs off the road that were coming on, then you're going to have more demand for gasoline, which is going to drive the price up, whereas it was actually driving the price down. So this anti-inflation promise that Trump made going in, you're actually going to see, not only are you seeing with the tariffs, but you're also now going to see it with energy prices significantly going up. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about energy demand going up with some of these data centers and everything, but this is the perfect storm that is going to drive prices up. And I think people need to understand who is responsible for that, and that this is bad policy, both from an economic and an environmental perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, let's talk about that growing demand, because Right. In addition to, as you say, maybe, reducing people's conversion to electric vehicles and that kind of thing, we also, across the country, but heavily concentrated in a lot of southern states, are getting this explosion of these new data centers, crypto mines in some places. But, basically these giant boxes that just consume unbelievable amounts of energy that are being welcomed and are being incentivized themselves in a lot of our states. Here in Tennessee, we're seeing our state leadership really roll out the red carpet for Elon Musk and his big XAI project in Memphis. But that's happening everywhere. It's happening in Georgia. It's happening in Alabama. So I guess how are you all approaching that issue? Because I think, for one thing, there's not a tremendous amount of public awareness. Most of these things are kind of built out in more rural areas. People aren't necessarily seeing them, but what's the impact of that going to be?
It's a huge question. And anybody who claims they have a crystal ball, or anybody that is telling you with a high degree of confidence that they know, is misleading, because we are somewhat in uncharted territory here. Because first of all, taking currency digital with crypto and everything, has never been done before. And there's, this administration is very enthusiastic for that. Our senator from Tennessee, Haggerty, is all about, crypto everything. And that has been driving a lot of demand. And then you have artificial intelligence. I personally believe that there is a certain amount of a artificial intelligence bubble that we're seeing unfolding that is causing these massive amounts of speculation. Let me give you an example. In Georgia, we were in the Georgia IRP, the Integrated Resource Plan, where they're looking out over the next 5 to 10 years about what they're going to do. And they were basically saying that they were almost going to have to double the size of their system because of all of the artificial intelligence demand that they expected, because Atlanta was going to be a place that was really going to be an epicenter for a lot of this. Some of this is speculative because there are people who recognize that you get, first mover advantage if you get into so the utilities have queues of where people are trying to hook up to their grid. And if you can get in there and hold a space, then that becomes valuable. And so there's all kinds of speculation going on to try to get in here. But the utilities have to take that seriously until they know otherwise, right? And so when they're looking at planning, this is causing the speculative growth that is being forecast is something that we haven't seen in decades in the United States, because really from 2010 until after COVID, we kind of had to even a flat to declining load growth. Productivity was going up because what we did was we separated GDP, gross domestic product, from energy consumption. And so once you had that separation, you could hold energy consumption flat, but you could still grow. And that was largely done by good programs in energy efficiency. But we're losing that separation, and now you're beginning to see these very energy-intensive data centers. You mentioned XAI in Memphis. We've been very actively tracking that and involved in opposing some aspects of what they've done. Elon comes in a year or so ago, and his guys at XAI say, we're going to build one of the largest supercomputers in the world. We're going to have 100,000 graphic processing units. That's the sort of the sense of how the size of these things. And that's pretty large. And it's going to use roughly 150 megawatts. That's a lot of juice. That's, that's really as much as, some small towns use, He gets it worked out a little bit with TVA and Memphis Light, Gas and Water, the utility over there. And then a few months later, they go, oh, well, we're going to 10X this. We're going to go from 100,000 GPUs to 1 million. Okay, well, going from 100,000 GPUs, which was already using 150 megawatts of power, 10X that's like 1,500 megawatts worth of power, over 1,000 megawatts, which is as much energy as 1/3 of the whole city of Memphis, which is one of the largest, cities in the Southeast, use. And so then a couple of weeks ago, Musk literally posted on X or Twitter that he wants to take it from 1 million to 50 million. 50 million GPUs would be on the order of half of all the power that TVA generates. It's just some astronomical amount. So the hubris and the unbridled ambition of some of these tech bros about what they think this supercompute's going to do is off the chains. But yet, because they have so much money and because you've got all these South Africans in the White House, Mark Andreessen, and
Peter Thiel.
Peter Thiel, yeah. And was it David Sands or whatever? But, they've got all these guys, and Musk was there for a while. They've got Trump's ear, and then you've got Sam Altman and all these guys, let's, hurry up and break something so that we can then, come in and remake it. So it's out of control right now. And the utilities are really struggling with what to do. Matter of fact, MLG&W eventually told Musk, we can't move that fast. We're not going to do it. So what does Musk do? He goes and buys a gas plant somewhere else in the world, is bringing it right across the state line in Mississippi, and is going to try to have it. So this is what you'd call a behind the meter, 1 gigawatt plus kind of gas plant, which is like unprecedented. Some of these guys have tried to start up old nuclear plants, like what's happening at 3 Mile Island. Meta's down in Louisiana, talking about massive getting in with the gas fields. Texas and Pennsylvania are both talking about, well, we've got access to these gas fields. Maybe we'll build gas plants just to supply. So AI now is becoming a major engine of demand. And unfortunately, whereas many of these technology companies, Apple, Amazon, Meta, Google, had very ambitious carbon goals, they're all now letting those slip. And what they're doing is many of them are rushing to build more power sources out of fossil gas that is going to set them back on their carbon goals, and going to set our country back. And AI is becoming a major driver for gas expansion. If you order a gas turbine today, you can't get it now for 6 years. That's how backlogged they are, which again is why prices are going to go up. Because not only do you have this unprecedented demand for AI, but you also now have the human growth and use that's going on, and the electrifying, which we need to. I mean, we're all about electrify everything, because if you can get the grid decarbonized and then everything is electric, that is better than having, you're burning, fossil gas for your stove or your heating or for your, all these other things. If you can get everything electrified, we can actually see a path towards reducing carbon emissions where we stabilize the planet. Whereas if you become more dependent on fossil fuels, that exacerbates the problem.
So this is a fairly cloudy forecast at the moment. But what is going on the ground in terms of clean energy? I mean, you talked about the ways that some investments are going to be dialed back, and the incentives are probably going to affect consumer behavior. But it does also seem that solar and wind in particular have reached a real level of viability and economy where even without some of those incentives, people are still building them, right? So how much activity is there going to continue to be on the clean energy front, even with those kind of rollbacks from the federal level?
Yeah, two things can be true at once. I mean, we are seeing some of the most devastating rollbacks and undercutting of the technology, but at the same time, the horse has left the barn. There's momentum building. And what Trump 2.0, I mean, we still got ways to go with this administration, but what it looks like they're going to do is, instead of getting, say, significant reductions, we're going to get reductions, but they're going to be more modest. And that means that we're not going to make the same progress in reducing the U.S. emissions. And that means that we're going to further exacerbate climate change. But we're still seeing growth in wind and solar. We're still seeing tremendous growth in batteries. Matter of fact, batteries survive. Storage actually didn't get hit hard in the big bullshit bill. And interestingly, a trifecta of a Republican Congress and White House basically effectively said, yes, we're still willing to incentivize with federal dollars decarbonization. We're just going to do it for the ones we like. So because Chris Wright at the Energy Department has a history in geothermal, they're looking at advanced geothermal. There's always been this, favoritism towards nuclear power, even though the Republicans used to always tell me, well, we can't do solar. We don't want to pick winners and losers. They're certainly picking winners and losers right now. And they're basically making solar and wind lose. And they're putting heavy bets on advanced nuclear that they want to do. Pulling carbon out of the air is still being incentivized in the bill that passed. So there are elements that are going forward. I think where we're going to see in the South, there are some projects that are, I think, teetering. There's some projects that have pulled back. Georgia was a phenomenal beneficiary to the Inflation Reduction Act because you had Hyundai make a major investment in it. We talk about a battery belt actually in the Southeast where so many battery manufacturers have come down. Ford came into West Tennessee and was going to build the F-150 Lightning in their Blue Oval City. Over in North Carolina, you had Toyota make massive investments in batteries, even though Toyota is not as into the full battery, all electric. They are heavy into hybrids, and so these batteries were being done. You've seen a number of GM and others making big investments. Rivian had a plant in Georgia that, they had to throttle back on, but now they're sort of trying to see if they can get it back going. And then you had manufacturing like Q-Cell in northern Georgia that was doing solar panels near Dalton. They were actually talking about expansion. There was a Vietnamese company that was going to locate in North Carolina that for solar. So all these things are in play. Now they're trying to figure out, wait, what's going to happen? And yes, projects are on hold. Everybody's waiting with bated breath about how the Treasury says, how do you safe harbor? And then they threw this other thing in there called foreign entities of concern, which means that if some piece of your product is made in China, North Korea, Iran, or Russia, then you don't get favored treatment. And so this has basically, everybody's waiting for those rules to be figured out because they become more aggressive. And is primarily targeted at China. And you could literally have a screw or something in a inverter that is manufactured in China and it would disqualify you. It's that kind of aggressive. And those terms are still being worked out. So there's a lot of uncertainty right now, but there's been so much investment and so much has already been laid out. And because the price points are still superior, you're going to see much of this stuff move forward. We're going to see some frozen, some cancelizations, but the South is still going to benefit, just not benefit as much. And that means less jobs, less good paying jobs. But more importantly, as I've indicated a couple of times, we as a country are betting on last century's technology as opposed to betting on the 21st century technology. And we are abdicating to China solar, batteries, and electric vehicles. And people say, okay, well, that's fine. Well, the reality is electric vehicles are getting so good now, and the price points are coming down so fast, particularly in China, that they are going to eat our lunch internationally. And I would not be surprised if we don't see another bailout in the future for some of the U.S. automobile industry because they had momentum. It got kneecapped by the big bullshit bill. And now you can see Ford trying to figure out what to do next. GM's trying to figure out, Chrysler's trying to figure out what to do next because they don't really know. And when you have the commander in chief, talking down the 21st century technology, then people are confused. And there's a lot of people that listen to Trump as if he's some sort of prophet. And the reality is he's basically looking in the rearview mirror and talking about what used to be and trying to keep propping that up instead of looking out the windshield and seeing where we're going. It's like that Gretzky quote, you skate to where the puck is going, and he's not skating to where the puck is going. He's looking, back over his shoulder, and it's going to be devastating. And so, this is what is so unfortunate, because with some insight and understanding what's going on in these technologies, we've kneecapped ourselves and unnecessarily, and to enrich a bunch of people who are already rich by giving these tax breaks, and to basically reward a lot of people in the fossil fuel industry who were actually feeling the pressure for the first time ever that their product was going to be less used. And so they came in with full force in the Trump administration to try to prop it up for one last stand, one last big party. But it's going to set us back. That's just all there is to it.
All right. Well, I guess that's as good a place to leave it as we can come to right now. Thanks a lot for your time, and I'll keep in touch. And
yeah, absolutely.
Be happy to circle back and kind of see where we're at a little bit down the line.
Yeah, and I don't want to. I hate to end on a bad note, because there are things that are happening in our region that we are tremendously excited about. Florida Power and Light has the most aggressive solar program of any utility in the United States right now. And they're laying down solar even in one of the most conservative states with one of the most conservative governors and legislature. They are laying down solar faster than just about anybody else in the country. EVs are expanding, and we've got a number of southeastern states that are really on the map in their utilization of electric vehicles. And these batteries, they're critical for both electric vehicles and for storage. I think many of those projects are going to stay intact. And so, the question is, how does the South get its political alignment of its most outspoken leaders basically focus on the future instead of focused on the past? And that's why people need to communicate with their elected representatives, and they need to talk about these issues both from an economic and an environmental point of view, because climate change, is only intensifies. The disruption is intensifying. It's an existential threat, and we've got to do something about it. So we are hopeful. I wouldn't be in this business for as long as I have been, working for this organization, if I felt hopeless. I feel empowered by what we've seen, and we've seen some really great changes over the last few years. So I want people to feel like it's doable, but we've got to stay engaged, and we've got to stand up and be vocal. Those of us who understand, what's going on, and we need to encourage other people to pay attention. Believe your lying eyes. Don't believe what you hear. When you see more flooding, when you see more extreme hurricanes, Helene and other things, you see these wildfires, you see all this stuff. Don't let somebody tell you it's a hoax. Believe your lying eyes, because it is real. It is as real as gravity. So thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to share our thoughts.
All right. Well, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.
The Mississippi Book Festival returns this Saturday to the grounds of the state capitol in Jackson. The festival was founded in 2013 and moved to the capital 2 years later. It brings together authors, publishers, booksellers from across the state, and, of course, lots of eager readers. Events include panel discussions inside the state capitol and a lively open-air book market on the grounds and surrounding streets. This year's festival is bringing dozens of authors to speak and sign books, including Imani Perry, Alice Randall, the historians Kai Bird and Garrett Graff, the musician Swamp Dogg, and former Mississippi Governor Haley Barbour. Many states have literary festivals of one kind or another, of course, but Mississippi undeniably punches above its weight as far as literary bona fides go. Although it is the smallest southern state by population and the poorest by median income, over the past century it has produced an impressive roster of writers. There's William Faulkner, of course, and Eudora Welty, Richard Wright, Tennessee Williams, K.A.C. Lehman, Ellen Gilchrist, Richard Ford, Jesmyn Ward, Larry Brown, Barry Hannah, and many more. One of Mississippi's contemporary luminaries, W. Ralph Eubanks, contemplated the state's talent for producing writers of note in his 2021 book, A Place Like Mississippi. He located it in deep experiences of conflict and trauma, racial oppression and generational poverty, but also in its pastoral landscapes and rural life. Eubanks wrote, "Like Ireland, Mississippi's history is filled with suffering that must be explained. It is a place that comes alive in its stories and inspires those stories, which flow through every bend of its winding rivers and across every piece of land within its borders. It is the beauty of the land, mixed with the state's complex history, that inspires and perplexes its writers. That is the burden one feels when writing about Mississippi, because it is a place that everyone knows about, or at least claims to, yet few are willing to understand. So, if you are willing to understand, you can probably hear a lot about it this weekend. The Mississippi Festival of Books takes place Saturday, September 13th from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. You can find more information on its website, msbookfestival.com. And that wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit media outlet, and you can find information about contributing to our efforts on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. If you do feel moved to make a donation, first of all, thank you. And second, make sure you make a note in the comments accompanying it that it is for the Progressive South. Thanks to Bark for our theme music and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. Remember, you can call and say hey from wherever you are. Just leave us a message at 865-214-7764. That's 865-214-PROG. Tell us your first name, where you're calling from, and take up to a minute to let us know what's going on where you are. You can also write me at jmayshark@theprogressivesouth.org. We'll talk to you soon.